Welcome to Beyond the Chain, the podcast from Nash that takes a deep look into blockchain technology and connects the dots between decentralized finance, business, and the wider world. I'm your host, Chris Fenwick, and each week I'm joined by a Nash founder and a special guest. This week here with me is Nash co-founder Ethan Fast.
Hey, Chris.
Our guest today is Beniamin Mincu, an early blockchain pioneer in Europe, the founder and CEO of MetaChain Capital, an investment firm, and also co-founder and CEO of Elrond, a distributed transactional computation platform which relies on a sharded state architecture and a secure proof-of-stake consensus mechanism.
Hello, Chris.
So, Ethan, you are a technical advisor for Elrond. How did you become aware of their project and get involved with the team?
I've been honored to be an advisor to Elrond for a few years now. I actually first met Beniamin through Fabio.
We met in San Francisco at a NEO event a long time ago. And from that point, we kept the conversation going and we got into contact, had some discussions, and it's great to have had you as an advisor.
Beniamin, would you like to tell us a bit more about your background?
Yeah, sure. When I was little, I basically was one of the first to have a computer. I think in my class, even though we were in Romania and so forth, I have three brothers. And my father, I remember very well, brought us a computer, and it was super exciting for us. We started playing, of course, breaking it very fast, and then started repairing it and learning a lot of things. But then the internet came along. In Romania, interestingly enough, we have one of the fastest internet speeds in the world. And so the computer and the internet essentially opened a different world to me, to a lot of people here. And then from that point, I remember that I always had a very deep passion for everything related to computers. So after that, when I discovered deeper technologies and startups, I became extremely fascinated, especially by technologies that have the potential to change the scope of society. So this is how in 2012, 2013, I stumbled into Bitcoin. And Bitcoin was extremely intriguing because for the first time it combined not only technology, but it combined technology with economics. 2016, together with my brother, I essentially started a fund through which we invested in probably 20 to 30 startups in the blockchain space, especially to help them move a lot faster, solve some of the problems, and also get a very deep overview on what was happening. Long story short, after all this time, at the end of 2017, seeing that the most fundamental problems in the space were not getting solved. This is when we decided that the best way to address some of these problems and improve what we thought was really necessary for the space to move forward was to just form very strong team, a team with which we can literally build rockets and address some of these problems. So this is how we started Elrond.
Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about Elrond and particularly what the vision of the company is and what your aspirations are?
Sure. Our vision with Elrond is to build a global, transparent, non-inflationary financial system, and then to give anyone, anywhere, easy access to this system. And we're trying to specifically do this first by building this most advanced state sharded proof of stake architecture. So it's a blockchain that can process transactions at 1,000 fold the performance of Bitcoin or Ethereum, and at 100 or 1,000x lower cost than Bitcoin and Ethereum right now, such that at this point we can process more than 15,000 transactions per second with 6-second latency and 0.001 1 cent transaction cost. We're super excited about this. The most important part is that this network is already live, so it's not just a theoretical discussion. Secondly, in addition to the network through which we want to bring broadband speed to the blockchain space, we also understand that there needs to be a sort of radical improvement in terms of user experience. Because if every user has to understand what we're doing here and work with the technology that is currently very, very painful to work with, it will not have any kind of adoption. So we've put a lot of thought into this and created Maya, which is a super simple user interface that will give access to all the key features of Elrond's blockchain and will open this access to anyone in the world with a mobile phone. So together, these pieces should really accelerate the great things we've been seeing in the space, and we welcome any effort toward the same goal. So this is where I see a lot of commonality with Nash, and we're excited about how things are progressing there as well.
One thing that's always really resonated with me about what you're working on at Elrond is your focus on the user experience and really making it possible for many more people to interact with this technology, which sort of to date still is kind of riddled with all these issues like needing to understand cryptography and how you should store your secrets and all of these things that for truly global broad adoption, people are just not going to understand, right? They need to be solved. So I think that's like really a core focus both for Nash and for Elrond. Kind of with a different hat also, you didn't mention this quite as much. My feeling is you're actually bringing some of that to the developer experience as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I haven't personally spent a lot of time developing anything on Elrond yet, although I hope that changes pretty soon. But from what I can tell, it looks like the tooling that you're building out there is really impressive too. So kind of the users as developers is also a nice theme, I think, that you have going.
For sure, for sure. And thanks a lot for bringing that up. I do believe that our team has put an enormous effort into solving, like I said, the technology problem first and making sure that there's very high performance that you can work with that makes sense not only in processing capacity, but then also in economics of transaction cost and so forth. But then moving one step further, we've seen a lot of effort put also in the design of how the developers will interact with the architecture. And this is not only in the tooling, but also in the economics design. So for instance, we have this really cool feature of providing 30% royalties that are built in for any smart contract that is built on Elrond. So the author has a built-in economics model there to make sense of a business that he wants to build. And whenever he has adoption, this adoption is immediately and directly reflected in money that he will be able to use. And then adding to that, we indeed have WASM VM that we're building on so that people can build stuff and make sure that they can do it in C++ and in Rust.
Yeah, for sure. One very kind of special thing that Nash does is the security of the accounts through an API key setup using threshold signatures to allow people to interact with the exchange without taking the risk that whatever bot they're using has access to private keys that they can then compromise the funds. And so to build this stuff out, we had to go through a pretty complex protocol and implement this for Neo, Ethereum, and for Bitcoin. Whereas on Elrond, basically the scheme you're using allows threshold signatures kind of as a default, right? So if you take a private key and then you do this simple transform on it, you get these two keys, which can then produce signatures, which then can be combined. And there's very little work involved. It's the developer experience around that is super nice. That's a kind of better cryptographic design that makes building these other technologies on top of it so much easier. So we're looking forward to integrating with that because that will be much less pain than it was for these other blockchains.
Yeah, for sure. I get a sort of boost anytime when we discuss with someone that can also look under the hood and understand some of these technologies that have been built. It's fairly rare that people can see the nuances of these technologies. And as you rightly point out, when you look at the specifics and nuances, that you discover how many cool things you can really build and how much easier it is, especially if you've gone through the same process with Bitcoin, Neo, Ethereum, and then you also have a reference point to compare. There's a lot of use cases that can be built with these new primitives that we have. And we already see a good number of developers trying things out and going through them. But it's especially interesting to see someone with your background see these nuances in a different way. So very much appreciate your feedback there.
Yeah, for sure.
So, Benjamin, you talked about how Elrond is trying to solve scaling problems with Bitcoin and Ethereum. So, a lot of people now will have noticed that Ethereum fees have become very, very high because of all the activity on the network due to DeFi. Maybe we could step back a little bit and you could tell us a bit more about what it is that makes Bitcoin and Ethereum slow and inefficient, and also talk a little bit more about the things that Elrond is doing to try to solve these problems.
Sure. So the idea is that Bitcoin came along and offered a way of transferring value without a trusted third party. This is the contribution that the blockchain brings. It can sort of be seen as a database that, in contrast to the normal database, it's operated by many self-interested arbitrary individuals. What matters is that there's an economics design on top of the architecture that keeps a lot of people incentivized to go toward a particular direction. But the problem with Bitcoin and Ethereum especially is at the base layer, they're very constrained in terms of processing capacity, such that Bitcoin can process something like 7 transactions per second, and Ethereum can process something like 15 transactions per second. And the important point there is that the design of a network only allows for all the participants in the network to process the same amount and quantity of work. So there is no parallelization in this architecture. Whereas what we've done with Elrond, when looking at these problems from many different angles, and discovered that there's something much deeper there, that essentially if you can parallelize transaction processing instead of processing everything in a serial manner with every participant processing the same amount of work, you get to a very different setup where you can process 2 or 3 orders of magnitude more transactions to begin with. So to simplify, sharding, anyone who's looked at databases knows sharding is a way of partitioning the database so you can parallelize processing. In blockchains, there's 3 types of sharding. It's state sharding, network sharding, and transaction sharding. State sharding has been typically the hardest problem to solve because it's in a distributed setting. You have many complex problems that you need to address. And from what we know, Elrond is the first architecture to have solved this and have a working model in production that has both cross-shard execution for transactions. So coming back to the scaling problem, Elrond addresses this to state sharding, where we're partitioning the network and having transaction parallelization so that we can do the work a lot more efficient and with a lot less cost. The one last thing that I would add is the adaptivity. What we have is adaptive state sharding, which means that this design allows us to start with only 2 shards and process 10,000 transactions per second, but then it also allows us to change the number of shards dynamically in real time, such that if there is demand, we can immediately update the network as it is. So yeah, I'm curious if this clarifies the questions and if Ethan wants to add something to that.
Yeah, sure. Maybe let me just restate it like really quickly to make sure I understand and help other people understand it too. So with sharding, you can almost think of it like you had one blockchain, everybody had to agree on the state of the world. And instead, now we're going to split the state of the world into multiple different pieces. And as long as you're only interacting on one piece, that piece can decide the state of the world itself at whatever speed it can. And so we don't have to wait on all the other states of the world because it only cares about what's going on within itself. And then you just have a coordination issue where you need to get those shards to agree on some common state, which I think is like the meta chain. And so by having those different shards, basically you can make as many as you want theoretically. As long as they don't have to interact with one another, you can basically make it as fast as the number of shards you have. Like just add more shards, everything gets like much faster. What you mentioned that was super interesting is this idea of the state sharding. So to try to unpack that a little bit, I would phrase that as like, so, people are pretty familiar with like smart contracts on Ethereum,
Hmm.
for example.
Hmm.
So if I have just like an ERC20 token, right? So this is like any token on Ethereum. I want to move it around. Basically, that token maintains like a database or an index of who has what. And so when I move this token from one person to another, what actually happens is like the smart contract managing the token says, oh, okay, I'm going to adjust this user's balance to this and this other user's balance to this, right? It's actually more complicated than that, but that's like kind of how it's working.
Hmm.
Um, and so if we're talking about sharding, if that token lives on one shard, then as long as you're moving it around on that shard can not even really have to interact with other shards, right? Because all the state lives there. It can do whatever it needs to do. And then the meta chain can keep going. So what happens when I want to use a piece of that state like on another shard? So for example, I want to send that token, let's say, to an address on another shard. Does that make sense as a problem? How would you describe Elrond's solution to that?
Hmm. Yeah, I do agree. It very much makes sense. So the idea is for our architecture, you basically have this meta chain that essentially keeps a track of everything that happens in the shards, but it keeps track via a very, very small amount of information, the smallest necessary amount of information that it needs to store in order to keep the shards in sync.
Some event is triggered, sort of. You could call it an event, which then, because it touched another shard, it's labeled such that it needs to be processed by the metachain. And so then
Mhm.
the metachain processes that, it validates it as part of its consensus. And then once that happens, the other shard is now aware of this event and can sort of understand the state based upon that. Is that roughly what's going on?
Yeah, so the idea is that you basically have the sender shard processing the information, and then at that point, the meta chain just makes sure that what has been processed is not in any way objected to.
I think there's another big component to the scaling solution Elrond has that I didn't hear us talk about a little bit, which is the proof of stake component. That's also an important piece, right?
For sure. So we have two very important breakthroughs that we built this entire architecture on. The first one is adaptive state sharding. And with this, we essentially scale things significantly to parallelize transaction processing. And then secure proof of stake is this mechanism through which we make sure that we process the transaction very efficient, fast, and then very secure. So we have this random sampling of the consensus group so that you have 500 nodes in each shards. Then from those 500 nodes, you have 61 that are randomly sampled every 5 seconds. You never know who will be in the consensus group. And then even if you would want to collude and do try to put some attacks on the network, you only have those 6 seconds, and after that, you're again randomly reshuffling the consensus mechanism. And then at the end of each epoch, which currently is defined as a day, you have again one third of nodes in each shard being reshuffled to other shards just to make sure that you have another layer of security there. So whereas the state sharding, adaptive state sharding model is especially responsible for scaling, the secure proof of stake mechanism is responsible for making sure that what needs to be processed can be processed in a very secure, very fast, and very efficient manner.
So we've been talking about scaling from a technical perspective, but maybe we can talk about scaling now in a business sense. So have you faced any barriers so far in running Elrond that have required you to pivot or change your design? And what are your plans for scaling and growing the Elrond team, the Elrond platform in the future?
Mm-hmm. So we have a very special target that we've set. So it works as a clear guiding direction. This is that we're trying to bring the next billion people in the blockchain space. And with such a clear idea in front of us, then a lot of the immediate decision, either immediate or medium long term, become it helps us prioritize some of the things. So we're of course at the point where we have launched the mainnet, and we have this really cool new application that is coming out and it's being tested, which is Maya. And what we are trying to do is approach things in two ways on the business side. First, we have several startups and projects that are trying to build on Elrond and use the smart contract design, architecture, and royalties that we've put in place. And we are quite excited about that. And on the other hand, we have this very, very clear path toward a lot of users adopting blockchain via Maya. And Maya is this application that will likely be the very simple user interface that people discover crypto through. It should be the simplest way they interact with. And we are now in a process of rapid iteration where the first version, the first Maya alpha version has been out. We've been going through two cycles with a bunch of great people from the community that are super passionate, close to Ron, and have been very early on the waiting list. And beyond that, we're trying to launch the first version as soon as possible and start growing very, very fast. There's a very high demand for the application. So in after 2 days of launching or revealing a preview of the application, we gathered 50,000 people on a waiting list that wanted to get access to Maya. So we're obviously quite excited about this and want to push things so we have the first version as soon as possible and then focus all our energy on growth on that direction. The team has been growing. We are, I think, one of the smallest teams in the space that's doing a fairly large number of things. We have a lot of really, really resourceful people that are putting a lot of energy, but we are about to grow the team very fast. I think it always is remarkable how fast the teams grow, but then the output or the productivity does not necessarily grow with the team's growth. Rather, it diminishes immediately after you grow, and then only after some time you can grow the output as well. So at this point, we're really focused on speed. And then once the first version of Maya is out, we're going to expand a lot more. Ethan, I'm curious how things look on your end. Have you guys expanded a lot? Do things move really fast on your end as well?
Yeah. I mean, growing the Nash team has definitely been a really interesting and exciting experience for us too. I think Elrond is working in traditional, more physical kind of office space. Correct me if I'm wrong about that. Nash has actually always been a remote company. This is something we talk about a lot, and there's some really interesting challenges building remote companies. I think all of us as we grew the team to like 30, I was pushing 40 people, the coordination issues when you're dealing with asynchronous remote teams are just really, really challenging. And we had to design new structures and processes around that. So that's something we've been learning a lot from over time. I think the world has kind of been thrown into a remote sort of context in a way, right, with the pandemic. So maybe you guys have also had to deal with that a little bit. But for us, that's been the kind of really interesting challenge there.
I do agree that this is super challenging, especially when you compare it with in-house setup where you meet the people and so forth. And it's been a very interesting experience for us because we have an office and there's very good energy in the office where people meet each other, they discuss things, problems get solved. And I've always felt that whenever I left the office, there was this very fast streamed river that's flowing, and you're stepping away. Whenever you're in the office, everyone is going, there's a lot of things happening, and there's a great energy there. But then when you leave, it's a strange feeling for a few days, and then you get used to it. But interestingly enough, when we had to switch to a remote setup with the pandemic, things have worked extremely well. I would say we've put in place a few things like a daily sync to begin with, and then free flowing communication so people can join a hangouts group and sit around and have a discussion and so forth. And it's remarkable how much these smaller things have helped the team keep in touch, keep in sync, and then work through any other problems. And then interestingly enough, we had an even higher output of productivity and energy during the time when we were remote.
Yeah. I think we've also kind of had some productivity boost from the pandemic. I think there's definitely an effect where when there's like literally nothing else that you can do, people actually are more inclined to spend time on their computer, which is, I guess, nice for a startup.
Yeah.
COVID does actually highlight some interesting societal changes and the shift towards remote work, but perhaps we could talk a bit more about the broader vision for Nash and Elrond. So what kind of concrete societal changes do you potentially see coming about as a result of blockchain technology?
The current version of the economic system that has some problems that I think cannot be solved from the inside. It's so broken, and the feedback loops are not there to allow it to move in the right direction. So to this effect, we believe that we can come and complement the current economic model we have with the digital model, where, as I've said in the beginning, we can have a global, transparent, and non-inflationary financial system to which people can connect, interact with, and so forth. The second point is the distribution problem, and we specifically try to tackle this through Maiar, because through Maiar, as long as you have internet and a mobile phone, you'll be able to access this new economic system. Then we also have the e-gold, which is the native currency of Elrond, which will give people access to a different store of value, one that is more robust, more sustainable, and whose design and rules are always transparent and communicated and discussed with the community, and where improvements can always happen. So this is the immediate stuff that we're looking at. Tens of millions and hundreds of millions joining the space just because there's an obvious utility and incentive there. And hopefully during the next 3 to 5 years, our goal is to make sure we accelerate and onboard maybe 1 billion people to this space by making the technology totally invisible. So I'm curious, Ethan, how Nash is trying to push things on this front.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of shared goals there. I think in particular, just making the technology more accessible is really the key thing that we keep drilling on, empowering anyone, anywhere to be able to access this sort of new class of digital assets and sort of all the things they allow you to do. That's what we're trying to do. And I think the main thing that Elrond or that you guys are doing differently is that you, in addition to focusing on the interfaces around these technologies, you're also focusing on the core blockchain infrastructure, right? The core infrastructure that allows all this to happen in the first place. And so by solving those scalability issues there, that's obviously very helpful. So maybe we can already allow someone to transact with cryptocurrencies just with what they would think of as like a typical user account. But that's not going to solve the problem of, their transactions taking like several hours with Bitcoin or, these kinds of slower feedback loops and weird error states. I think there's a strong kind of complementary vision with our two companies.
Yeah, totally agree.
Beniamin, is there perhaps anything else you'd like to discuss or talk about?
I'd say that the most important thing for Elrond right now is that the network is live. We've been working super hard to bring this to the market. Now our core focus is on adoption. adoption through Maya will come with the speed that is impossible to be brought via other means. So this whole vision of improving the financial ecosystem is exactly what we need during the next period. And it seems to me that Elrond is at the cutting edge, just laying the necessary pieces so that not only Elrond, but anyone else who has a particular vision through which we can accelerate things, can build things on Elrond and improve the lives of users and people anywhere in the world. We welcome people in the community to build smart contracts on Elrond and start deploying cool applications there. They can also become validators, and there's an entire universe there as well. We're super excited about all of this, one of which is the integration with Nash as well, and just having eagled there to be tradable will be really cool for our communities. So we're quite excited about all of this.
Yeah, we're super excited too, and I look forward to developing more on Elrond.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It certainly sounds like there is a lot of shared vision between the companies. Thanks a lot to Ethan for joining us today.
Thanks, Chris. It was great to be here. I'm glad we were able to have Beniamin on.
Yeah, and thanks also to Beniamin.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thanks, Ethan. Lovely to have this conversation.
And thank you to everyone who listened to Beyond the Chain. Subscribe with your favorite listening stream and you won't miss an episode. You can find the full text of today's episode at podcast.nash.io.